The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched my daughter Emma glide across the dance floor in her flowing white gown, her new husband's arms wrapped around her waist. The reception was everything she'd dreamed of. Twinkling lights strung across the garden pavilion, roses cascading from every table, and 200 guests celebrating under the stars. I should have been floating on pure joy, but instead, I felt like I was drowning in front of everyone I'd ever known. 20 minutes earlier, Emma had stood at the microphone during her maid of honor speech and delivered words that sliced through me like broken glass disguised as gratitude. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started at 5:30, just like every other morning for the past 6 months. My alarm hadn't even finished its first chime before I was pulling on my robe and padding downstairs to the kitchen. Coffee first, then the endless list that had consumed my life since Emma announced her engagement to Marcus last Christmas. Today was the day we'd been building toward, her wedding day, and every detail had to be perfect. I stood at the kitchen island with my notebook spread open, pages filled with my cramped handwriting. Vendor confirmations, timeline adjustments, last-minute guest dietary restrictions, backup plans for weather, backup plans for the backup plans. The florist would arrive at 9, the caterer at 10, the photographer at noon. Emma's hair appointment was at 2, makeup at 4, and the ceremony started at 6 sharp. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Helen. "Nervous? You should be so proud today." I smiled, despite the knot in my stomach. Proud didn't even begin to cover it. Emma was my only child, and I'd poured everything into making sure she had the wedding of her dreams. We'd visited 17 venues before finding the perfect garden estate. I'd driven to 3 different cities to find the exact shade of blush roses she wanted. I'd hand-addressed 200 invitations because Emma said my handwriting was more elegant than any font. The house felt different that morning, charged with anticipation. Emma was still sleeping upstairs. I'd insisted she rest while I handled the final coordination. Marcus had spent the night at his parents' hotel, following the tradition Emma suddenly cared about after ignoring most others. The bridal party would arrive at noon for lunch and preparation. Everything was falling into place exactly as we'd planned. My ex-husband David had called the night before to confirm he'd pick up his mother from the airport. "Carol, you've outdone yourself," he'd said, and I could hear genuine admiration in his voice. "Emma's lucky to have you managing all this." It meant more than he probably knew. David and I had divorced when Emma was 12, but we'd managed to stay civil, even friendly. He'd remarried 3 years later to a woman named Jennifer who worked in marketing and wore crisp blazers to soccer games. They lived 2 states away, which made the logistics more complicated, but kept the drama minimal. I'd been managing event planning for a boutique firm for 8 years now, so organizing a wedding wasn't entirely foreign territory. But this was different. This was Emma. Every vendor meeting, every tasting, every decision had been filtered through the lens of wanting her day to be flawless. I'd taken vacation time, worked weekends, and spent my own money on upgrades she didn't even know about because I wanted her to walk into her reception and feel like she'd stepped into a fairy tale. The funny thing was how natural it felt to take charge. Emma was brilliant. She'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in environmental science and landed her dream job with a conservation nonprofit in Portland. But she got overwhelmed by too many choices, especially when emotions were involved. During wedding planning, I'd learned to present her with 2 or 3 carefully curated options instead of overwhelming her with possibilities. She'd make the final call, but I'd done the research, made the calls, and handled the follow-up. Marcus was fine with whatever Emma wanted, which was sweet, but not particularly helpful when decisions needed to be made. He was a good match for her, steady, kind, and shared her passion for hiking and environmental causes. His family was nice enough, though his mother Patricia had some very specific opinions about wedding etiquette that didn't always align with Emma's more relaxed approach. I'd spent more than a few phone calls diplomatically navigating between what Patricia thought was proper and what Emma actually wanted. By 8 that morning, I was already dressed in the navy dress Emma had helped me pick out 3 months earlier. "You need something that photographs well, Mom," she said, holding up options in the department store. "But not too formal. We want you to look like yourself, just the most beautiful version." The dress fit perfectly, hitting just below my knees with sleeves that covered my upper arms. Emma had insisted I get my hair done too, so I had an appointment at 11. The phone rang as I was loading the dishwasher. Emma's voice was thick with sleep and excitement. "Mom, is everything ready? Did the flowers arrive? What about the cake?" I could hear her moving around upstairs, probably pacing by her window. "Everything's on track, sweetheart," I assured her. "The florist confirmed 20 minutes ago. The cake is stunning. Wait until you see it. Just focus on getting ready and letting yourself enjoy today." "I can't believe it's actually happening," she said, and I could hear her smile in her voice. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. This has been so much work, and you've handled every single detail." My chest warmed with satisfaction. "That's what mothers do, Emma. I wanted this to be perfect for you." "It will be."
I know it will be because you're handling it. After we hung up, I allowed myself a moment of pure contentment. 6 months of planning, coordination, and careful attention to every detail, and we were finally here. Emma was about to marry a wonderful man, surrounded by everyone who loved her, in a setting that would create memories to last a lifetime. I'd pulled it off. The rest of the morning flew by in a blur of arriving vendors, final confirmations, and small adjustments. The florist had outdone herself. The altar arrangements were breathtaking, cascading with the blush roses Emma loved, accented with white hydrangeas and trailing greenery. The reception tables looked like something from a magazine, each centerpiece slightly different but harmonious, exactly as I'd requested. Emma's bridal party arrived at noon, as planned. Her maid of honor was her college roommate Sarah, a sharp-witted lawyer who'd been Emma's closest friend for 6 years. The other bridesmaids were a mix of high school friends and cousins, all chattering with excitement as they settled into the living room for lunch. I'd ordered from Emma's favorite local cafe. Gourmet sandwiches, fruit salad, and sparkling water with cucumber. Nothing too heavy before the ceremony, nothing that would stain. I moved between the kitchen and living room, making sure everyone had what they needed, that the photographer was getting good shots of the preparation, that Emma's dress was hanging properly upstairs. It felt good to be needed, to be the one everyone turned to when they had questions. "Carol, where should we put the flowers for photos? Carol, what time should we start getting dressed? Carol, can you help with the zipper?" The afternoon unfolded exactly as I'd choreographed. Emma's hair came out perfectly, soft curls pinned to one side with small white flowers tucked in. Her makeup was natural but glowing, exactly what she'd requested. When she finally stepped into her dress, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The gown was simple but elegant, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that moved like water when she walked. "You look like a princess," her youngest bridesmaid whispered, and Emma laughed, tears threatening her carefully applied mascara. "Don't make me cry yet," she said. "We haven't even gotten to the ceremony." David arrived to escort her down the aisle, looking handsome in his dark suit and a tie that matched the wedding colors. Jennifer was with him, dressed appropriately and wearing a warm smile. "Emma, you're absolutely radiant," she said, and I appreciated that she'd kept the comment focused on Emma rather than taking any credit for the day. "Your mom has thought of everything," David told Emma, squeezing my shoulder briefly. "This is incredible, Carol, really." The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emma and Marcus had written their own vows, and there wasn't a dry eye among the guests as they promised to support each other's dreams, protect the environment together, and build a life filled with adventure and love. Emma's voice stayed steady throughout, but I could see her hand shaking slightly as she slid Marcus's ring onto his finger. I sat in the front row, watching my daughter become a wife, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment wash over me. This was what I'd worked toward for 6 months. This perfect moment, This perfect day, this perfect celebration of Emma's happiness. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and Marcus kissed Emma as the guests erupted in cheers, I felt tears of pure joy sliding down my cheeks. The cocktail hour was seamless. Guests mingled in the garden while the wedding party took photos, and the caterer's appetizers were clearly a hit. I circulated among family and friends, accepting compliments on the beautiful ceremony and stunning venue. Emma's grandmother took my hands and said, "Carol, dear, this is the most beautiful wedding I've ever attended. You should be so proud." "It's all for Emma," I replied, but the warmth of recognition felt wonderful. Marcus's family seemed genuinely pleased as well. His father complimented the choice of music during the ceremony, and even Patricia, who had opinions about everything, told me the floral arrangements exceeded her expectations. "You have exquisite taste, Carol," she said, and I knew from her tone that this was high praise indeed. As the sun began to set, guests moved into the reception pavilion for dinner. The space looked magical in the golden hour light, with string lights beginning to twinkle and candles flickering on every table. The head table was positioned perfectly for photos, with Emma and Marcus at the center and their wedding parties flanking them on either side. I was seated at a table with David, Jennifer, my parents, and Helen's family. Close enough to help if anything went wrong, but positioned so I could enjoy the celebration as a guest now that the coordination was essentially complete. The catering staff had everything under control, the photographer was capturing beautiful moments, and Emma looked radiant as she laughed with her new husband and their friends. Dinner was delicious. Herb-crusted salmon and beef tenderloin with roasted vegetables, exactly what Emma had chosen after our third tasting. The salad course featured the special vinaigrette dressing she'd fallen in love with, and the bread was from the artisan bakery we'd discovered during our vendor research. Every bite represented hours of planning and decision-making, but seeing the guests enjoy it made all the effort worthwhile. As dessert was being served, the DJ announced it was time for toasts. The best man went first, sharing funny stories about Marcus from college and expressing his confidence in the couple's future together. Then Sarah, Emma's maid of honor, took the microphone. Sarah was always articulate. It came with the lawyer training, but she'd clearly put thought into her words. She talked about meeting Emma their freshman year, about watching her grow into a confident, passionate woman who fought for what she believed in. She mentioned Emma's dedication to environmental causes, her loyalty as a friend, and her excitement about building a life with Marcus. "Emma has always known what she wanted," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly through the pavilion, "and she's never been afraid to work for it. She earned her degree, she landed her dream job, and she found a partner who shares her values and her vision for the future."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The guests were smiling, nodding along. Emma was glowing at the head table, Marcus's arm around her shoulders. Then Sarah's tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious. But what I admire most about Emma is her independence. She planned this entire wedding herself, made every decision, handled every detail. She wanted this day to reflect who she is and what matters to her, and she made sure it happened exactly that way. I felt a small chill, though I couldn't quite identify why. Emma spent months researching venues, meeting with vendors, coordinating timelines, Sarah continued. She chose every flower, every menu item, every detail of what you're experiencing tonight. She worked full-time while planning this wedding, often staying up late on weekends to make calls and visit vendors. She wanted her wedding to be personal and meaningful, and she wasn't willing to delegate that to anyone else. The applause was enthusiastic, but I felt like I was watching the moment through glass suddenly. Guests were looking toward Emma with admiration, and she was smiling and waving, accepting the recognition for work I had done. Sarah raised her glass. "So let's toast Emma, not just as a bride, but as a woman who knows her own mind and has the strength to make her dreams happen. Emma, you planned an absolutely perfect wedding, and Marcus is lucky to be marrying someone so capable and determined." "To Emma!" the guests called out,
raising their glasses. Emma stood to accept the toast, beaming with happiness and pride. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a small wave, but there was no acknowledgement of the disconnect between what Sarah had just said and reality. No correction, no sharing of credit. I lifted my glass with everyone else and took a sip of champagne that suddenly tasted flat. Around me, conversations resumed with guests complimenting Emma's planning abilities and attention to detail. "She's so organized," I heard someone say. "She thought of everything," said another. David leaned over and whispered, "That was a nice speech, though I'm not sure Sarah got all the facts right." He'd been involved enough to know I'd handled most of the vendor coordination. I managed a smile. It's Emma's day. It doesn't matter who gets credit. But even as I said the words, I felt something cracking inside my chest. 6 months of work, hundreds of hours of research and coordination, my vacation time, my expertise, my connections in the industry, all of it attributed to Emma's independence and capability. I'd spent so much energy making sure everything was perfect for her that I'd somehow become invisible in the process. The evening continued around me, but I felt disconnected from the celebration. Emma and Marcus's first dance was beautiful, and when they invited the parents to join them on the dance floor, I smiled and swayed with David while cameras flashed. But the joy I'd felt earlier had been replaced by a hollow feeling I couldn't quite name. During the father-daughter dance, I watched Emma laugh at something David whispered in her ear, and I felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy. He'd shown up today, looked handsome, walked her down the aisle, and danced with her. The emotional heavy lifting, the months of stress and coordination, the countless decisions and details, none of that was visible in this moment. What people would remember was how beautiful Emma looked, how smooth everything went, how capable she was. As the evening wound down and guests began to filter out, thanking me for a lovely time, I found myself wondering if this was how it always worked. If mothers were meant to do the work and daughters were meant to get the credit. If making everything look effortless meant that no one saw the effort at all. Emma found me near the dessert table as I was checking with the caterer about cleanup timing. She threw her arms around me in a champagne-scented hug, her veil slightly askew and her cheeks flushed with happiness. "Mom, wasn't tonight perfect?" she said, squeezing me tight. "I can't believe we pulled it off. Everything went exactly like I imagined." We. I. The pronouns blurred together, and I wasn't sure anymore which one applied to what. "It was beautiful, sweetheart," I said, hugging her back. "You looked radiant." "I felt like a princess," she said, pulling back to look at me. "And everyone kept telling me what a good job I did planning everything. Sarah's speech made me feel so proud. I really did think of everything, didn't I?" The question was innocent, asked by a daughter glowing with happiness on the most important day of her life. But it landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every hour I'd spent in vendor meetings, every phone call I'd made, every decision I'd researched and presented to her. "Yes," I said quietly. "You thought of everything." She beamed and spun away to say goodbye to more guests, leaving me standing alone by the dessert table, surrounded by the remnants of the perfect wedding I'd planned and she'd received credit for. The cleanup would take hours, but the catering staff had it handled. Emma and Marcus would leave soon for their honeymoon suite at a nearby bed and breakfast, and tomorrow they'd fly to Costa Rica for 2 weeks of adventure and relaxation. The vendors would pack up their equipment, the flowers would be distributed to guests who wanted them, and by Monday morning the garden estate would be reset for the next event. But I would go home to the lists and timelines I'd spent 6 months creating, to the vendor contacts I'd cultivated, to the expertise I developed and shared freely with my daughter. And I would try to figure out why giving Emma everything she wanted had left me feeling so empty. As I watched her dance with Marcus under the twinkling lights, laughing with the joy of someone who'd had the perfect wedding, I realized that somewhere in all my planning and coordinating and managing, I'd managed to plan myself right out of the story. I'd become the invisible force behind the magic, and Emma had become the magician who'd made it all appear. Tomorrow, when people talked about Emma's wedding, they would remember her as the capable bride who'd planned every detail herself. They would admire her organization, her taste, her attention to detail. And I would be the mother who wore a nice dress and cried happy tears. Present but not essential to the narrative of the day. The realization settled over me as the last song played and the evening came to an end. I'd given Emma the perfect wedding, exactly as I intended.
But in making myself invisible, I'd also made my contribution disappear. And standing there in the garden pavilion, surrounded by the evidence of months of my own hard work, I couldn't decide if that had been generosity or a mistake I was only now beginning to understand. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in my empty house with the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. My feet ached from the heels I'd worn for 12 hours, and there were rose petals stuck to the bottom of my purse from when I'd helped pack up the centerpieces. Emma and Marcus were probably having breakfast in bed at the charming inn where I'd booked their wedding night suite, and by afternoon they'd be on a plane to Costa Rica with itineraries I'd helped research and reservations I'd helped make. I padded to the kitchen in my robe and started coffee, then stood at the window looking out at my garden. It seemed impossibly quiet after yesterday's orchestrated chaos. My phone had been buzzing since 7 with text messages from family members and friends, all variations on the same theme. Beautiful wedding. Emma did such a wonderful job planning. What a talented daughter you raised. Each message felt like a small paper cut. I appreciated that people had enjoyed themselves, but the disconnect between their perception and reality was becoming harder to ignore. Helen had sent a long text about how impressed she was with Emma's organizational skills and attention to detail. David's sister had called Emma a natural event planner in her thank you message. Even my own mother had left a voicemail praising Emma's incredible ability to coordinate such a complex celebration. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my phone, reading through the messages and feeling increasingly invisible. It was as if I'd spent 6 months building a beautiful stage, only to have everyone compliment the actress on her set design skills. The worst part was that I'd contributed to this narrative myself, always deflecting praise toward Emma during the planning process. "It's her day," I'd said whenever vendors complimented my organization. "I'm just helping her vision come to life." But last night had crystallized something I'd been trying not to acknowledge. Emma hadn't just accepted the credit by default, she'd actively claimed it. When Sarah gave that toast about Emma's independence and capability, Emma had stood and beamed as if she'd actually spent those late nights on the phone with florists and caterers. She'd absorbed the praise for work she hadn't done, and she'd seemed genuinely proud of accomplishments that weren't hers. Around 10, my phone rang. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with something newer and more complicated. I answered on the third ring, modulating my voice to match the happiness I knew she'd be feeling. "Good morning, Mrs. Martinez," Emma said, and I could hear laughter in her voice at using her new married name. "Did you sleep well? I keep thinking about how perfect everything was yesterday." "Good morning, sweetheart. How was your night at the inn?" "Absolutely magical. The room was gorgeous, and they left champagne and strawberries. Marcus and I stayed up way too late just talking about the whole day. Everyone keeps texting us about what an amazing wedding it was." I wrapped my fingers tighter around my coffee mug. "I'm so glad you're happy with how everything turned out." "Happy? Mom, I'm over the moon. And honestly, I'm kind of proud of myself for pulling it all together. When Sarah gave that speech about my planning skills, I felt like I could conquer the world. I mean, I worked full-time and still managed to coordinate this entire celebration. That's not nothing, right?" The words hit me like cold water. Emma wasn't just accepting credit, she genuinely seemed to believe she'd earned it. I felt my throat tighten as I searched for a response that wouldn't ruin her honeymoon mood. "You should be proud," I managed. "It was a beautiful day." I keep thinking about what Sarah said about not being afraid to work for what I want. I mean, when I decided I wanted this specific venue, I made it happen.
When I had a vision for the flowers, I found the right florist. When I wanted that particular cake design, I convinced them to modify their standard options. I really did make sure every detail was exactly what I dreamed of. Each claim felt like a small betrayal, but what struck me most was that Emma seemed genuinely to believe what she was saying. In her mind, apparently, wanting something and achieving it were the same as doing the work to make it happen. Emma, do you remember who actually called the venues? Who met with the vendors and coordinated the timelines? There was a brief pause. Well, sure, you helped with some of the logistics, but the creative vision, the decisions, the overall coordination, that was all me. I mean, I chose everything. I made all the final calls. Helped with logistics. The phrase echoed in my head as Emma continued talking about their flight to Costa Rica and how excited she was to finally relax after months of intensive planning. I found myself only half listening, stuck on the casual way she'd reduced my role to administrative support. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen, feeling more unsettled than before. It was one thing to let Emma take credit in public to preserve her happiness. It was another thing entirely to discover that she'd apparently rewritten history in her own mind, casting herself as the protagonist of a story where I'd played the leading role.
I did laundry, cleaned the house, and returned the few wedding items that belonged to me. But every task reminded me of something I'd handled during the planning process that Emma now seemed to remember as her own accomplishment. Monday morning brought me back to my office at the event planning firm where I worked. My colleague Lisa knocked on my office door around 10 with coffee and curiosity. "So, how was the big day? I want to hear everything." "It was beautiful," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Everything went smoothly." "And Emma, how did she handle the pressure? First-time brides can get pretty stressed when they're managing all the details themselves." I looked at Lisa for a long moment. She knew what went into planning a wedding because she did it professionally. She understood the hours of coordination, the vendor management, the timeline development. If anyone would recognize the gap between Emma's claimed accomplishments and the reality of the work involved, it would be Lisa. "Actually," I said slowly, "Emma didn't manage most of the details herself. I handled the majority of the vendor coordination and timeline management." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's not the impression I got from your updates over the past few months. You always talked about Emma's decisions and Emma's preferences, because it was her wedding. But I did the research, made the calls, managed the logistics. Emma made the final choices, but I presented her with the options." "Ah," Lisa nodded knowingly. "The classic mother of the bride dynamic. You did the work, she got the experience. How does she feel about everything now that it's over?" "She's taking full credit for the planning," I said, surprised by how bitter the words tasted. According to her maid of honor speech, Emma coordinated every detail herself while working full-time. Emma stood up and accepted praise for work she didn't do. Lisa's expression shifted to something between sympathy and outrage. "Oh, Carol, that must have stung. The worst part is that I think she actually believes it. When I talked to her yesterday, she was proud of her organizational skills and planning abilities. She seems to genuinely think that making decisions is the same as doing the work to implement them." "Have you talked to her about it?" I shook my head. What's the point? She's on her honeymoon, she's happy, and correcting her version of events would just create conflict. The wedding was beautiful, and that's what matters. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Emma's happiness did matter, but so did the truth. And the truth was that I'd spent 6 months of my life creating something beautiful for my daughter, only to watch her claim credit for my work without apparent awareness or guilt. The week continued with a steady stream of thank you messages and social media posts from wedding guests. Emma had posted a series of photos with captions about the wedding I planned and bringing my vision to life. Friends and family members commented with praise for her organizational skills and aesthetic sense. Marcus posted a sweet tribute calling Emma the most capable woman I know and praising her for single-handedly creating the perfect celebration. Each post felt like salt in an open wound.
I found myself screenshotting the most egregious examples, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with the evidence. Show them to Emma when she returned? Send them to David? Keep them as proof that I wasn't imagining the scope of her revisionist history? By Thursday, I decided to talk to Helen. My sister had been at the wedding, had heard Sarah's speech, and had known enough about my involvement to understand the disconnect. I called her during my lunch break, hoping for validation or at least perspective. "Helen, I need to ask you something about Saturday," I began after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "Did Sarah's speech about Emma's planning abilities strike you as accurate?" Helen was quiet for a moment. "Well, Emma certainly looked proud when she was accepting all that praise. But you know I coordinated most of the vendor relationships and logistics. We talked about it multiple times over the past few months." "Of course I know that, Carol. You were completely overwhelmed with wedding tasks. I remember you missing my birthday dinner because you had a venue walkthrough." Relief flooded through me. At least someone remembered reality accurately. "So doesn't it bother you that Emma is taking credit for work I did?" Another pause. "Carol, honey, does it really matter? The wedding was beautiful, Emma's happy, and you got to give your daughter an incredible gift."
Isn't that what mothers do? The question landed like a slap. So I should just be happy that my months of work are being attributed to someone else? I think you should be happy that you were able to make Emma's dreams come true. That's more important than who gets the credit, don't you think? After we hung up, I sat in my office feeling more isolated than before. Even Helen, who knew the truth, seemed to think I was being petty for caring about acknowledgement. The message was clear. Good mothers give selflessly and don't expect recognition. Good mothers work behind the scenes and let their daughters shine. Good mothers don't need credit for their contributions. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't about needing praise or recognition from strangers. This was about my daughter actively claiming credit for work she hadn't done and seemingly believing her own fabricated narrative. This was about the way she'd absorbed compliments for skills she didn't have and accomplishments that weren't hers. And it was about the fact that this pattern wasn't limited to wedding planning. I'd been Emma's safety net her entire adult life, providing financial support, emotional guidance, and logistical help whenever she needed it. But Emma had learned to present these advantages as personal achievements, as evidence of her independence and capability. When she'd graduated college with minimal student debt, she'd attributed it to her financial responsibility, rather than acknowledging the tuition payments David and I had made. When she landed her dream job, she'd talked about her qualifications and interview skills without mentioning the professional connections I'd helped her cultivate. When she'd bought her first car, she'd been proud of her negotiation abilities without mentioning the down payment that had come from her trust fund. I'd been enabling this narrative for years, I realized, always stepping back to let Emma take credit, always framing my contributions as minor assistance rather than substantial support. I'd taught her to see my work as invisible by consistently making it so. Friday afternoon brought a call from my mother who wanted to rehash the wedding details and share more compliments she'd received about Emma's planning skills. Everyone at Bridge Club was so impressed when I told them Emma had coordinated everything herself, Mom said proudly. Margaret's daughter hired a wedding planner and spent twice as much for half the elegance. Emma has such natural talent for organization. Mom, I interrupted, Emma didn't coordinate everything herself. I handled most of the vendor relationships and logistics. Well, of course you helped, dear, but Emma made all the decisions. She's the one with the vision and the taste. Making decisions isn't the same as doing the work to make them happen. I spent months researching vendors, managing timelines, and coordinating details. My mother's tone cooled slightly. Carol, I don't understand why you're being so negative about Emma's accomplishments. The wedding was beautiful, and she should be proud of what she achieved. But she didn't achieve most of what people are giving her credit for. She achieved getting married to a lovely young man in a beautiful celebration surrounded by people who love her. That's what matters. This obsession with who did what behind the scenes is, frankly, a bit petty. Petty. The word followed me through the weekend as I tried to process the growing realization that no one in my family seemed to think my contributions mattered enough to acknowledge accurately. They were all happy to let Emma bask in praise for work she hadn't done, and they seemed to consider my frustration with this arrangement selfish and small. Sunday evening, Emma called from Costa Rica, bubbling with enthusiasm about ziplining and volcano tours. She sounded relaxed and happy, exactly how a new bride should sound on her honeymoon. But when she started talking about how proud she was of pulling off such a complex event, I felt something inside me snap. "Emma," I said, cutting through her description of a wildlife preserve they'd visited, "we need to talk about the wedding planning when you get home." "What about it? Is something wrong? Did someone complain about something?" "No complaints, but I think we need to clarify who actually did what over the past 6 months." Her voice became guarded. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've been taking credit for work I did, and I don't think that's fair or accurate." There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear Marcus asking if everything was okay. "Mom, I don't understand why you're upset about this. Yes, you helped with some things, but I made all the decisions. I chose the venue, the flowers, the menu, the music. I coordinated my vision for the day." "Choosing is different from implementing, Emma. I spent months managing vendor relationships, developing timelines, and handling logistics. You making final decisions doesn't erase the work I did to present you with options." "I never said you didn't help," she said, her tone becoming defensive. "But the overall planning, the creative vision, the project management, that was me." "No, Emma, it wasn't. The project management was me. The vendor coordination was me. The timeline development was me. You approved decisions, but you didn't do the work to make them happen."
Why are you trying to diminish what I accomplished? The question stunned me into silence. In Emma's mind, apparently acknowledging my contributions would somehow diminish her accomplishments. She'd constructed a narrative where my work was invisible and her decision-making was the primary achievement. "I'm not trying to diminish anything," I said quietly. "I'm trying to get an accurate acknowledgement of what actually happened. I don't understand why this matters so much to you. The wedding was beautiful, everyone had a wonderful time, and I'm married to the love of my life. Can't that be enough?" After we hung up, I sat in my living room feeling emotionally exhausted. Emma genuinely seemed to believe that my desire for accurate recognition was petty and unnecessary. She'd managed to convince herself that wanting credit for work I'd actually done was somehow selfish and destructive. But something had shifted during that conversation. For the first time in months, maybe years, I'd spoken up about the gap between perception and reality. I'd named the problem instead of absorbing it silently. And while Emma's reaction had been defensive rather than understanding, I'd finally stopped protecting her from the consequences of her actions. Monday morning, I found myself looking at the wedding photos Emma had posted on social media with new eyes. Every beautiful detail that guests were praising represented hours of my time, phone calls I'd made, vendors I'd coordinated with, problems I'd solved. The seamless elegance that everyone admired had been achieved through careful planning and meticulous execution. My planning and my execution. I'd given Emma the perfect wedding, but I'd also given her permission to erase my contribution from the story. And now that I'd finally spoken up about it, I was learning that no one wanted to hear the truth. They preferred the narrative where the capable daughter had achieved everything herself and the supportive mother had played a minor background role. But I was done being a minor character in stories where I'd been the primary actor. Emma might not be ready to acknowledge the reality of her wedding planning, but I was finally ready to stop pretending that her version of events was accurate. The question was, what to do with this new clarity? And whether anyone in my family would ever be willing to see past their comfortable fiction to recognize the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. 2 weeks later, Emma and Marcus returned from their honeymoon with glowing tans and hundreds of photos of rainforests and beaches. They came to my house for dinner on their first Sunday back, and I spent the morning preparing Emma's favorite meal, roasted chicken with herbs, garlic mashed potatoes, and green beans with almonds. The same meal I'd cooked for special occasions throughout her childhood, the same meal she'd requested before every important milestone. Emma bounced through my front door with an energy I hadn't seen in months. The stress of wedding planning finally lifted from her shoulders.
She hugged me tightly and immediately launched into stories about their adventures. Ziplining through cloud forests, swimming in volcanic hot springs, and hiking to waterfalls hidden deep in the jungle. Marcus followed behind with a relaxed smile, looking like a man who just had the vacation of his lifetime. "Mom, you have to see these pictures," Emma said, pulling out her phone as we sat down to eat. "The wildlife was incredible. We saw toucans and sloths and these tiny poison dart frogs that were bright blue. And the beaches. I've never seen water so clear." I smiled and made appropriate comments about the photos, but part of my attention was focused on watching Emma's animated storytelling. She was happy and relaxed, exactly what I'd wanted for her after months of wedding stress. But underneath my pleasure at seeing her joy, I could feel the unresolved tension from our phone conversations still simmering. "So, what's been happening here?" Marcus asked, as Emma continued scrolling through pictures. "Anything exciting in the real world while we were living in paradise?" "Work's been busy. We're planning a corporate retreat for 200 people next month, so lots of logistics to coordinate." Emma looked up from her phone. "That sounds complicated. Good thing you're so organized, Mom. You're really good at the behind-the-scenes stuff." The casual dismissal in those words, behind-the-scenes stuff, made my jaw tighten. After everything we'd discussed, Emma was still reducing my professional expertise to background support. "Actually," I said carefully, "event planning requires quite a bit of strategic thinking and creative problem-solving. It's not just logistics." Emma nodded absently, already returning to her photos. "Sure, but you know what I mean. You're great at making other people's visions happen." Making other people's visions happen. As if my role was always to be the invisible force behind someone else's success, never the architect of my own achievements. The conversation moved on to other topics: Marcus's return to work, Emma's upcoming projects at the nonprofit, and their plans for settling into married life. But I found myself only half listening, stuck on the casual way Emma continued to frame my contributions as secondary and supportive rather than substantial and skilled. After dinner, Marcus went outside to take a phone call from his brother, leaving Emma and I in the kitchen. She was helping me load the dishwasher, humming softly to herself, when I decided I couldn't let the moment pass without addressing what had been building between us. "Emma, I want to talk about our phone conversation from Costa Rica." Her hands stilled on the plate she was rinsing. "What about it?" "I don't think you understood what I was trying to say. It's not about getting credit or recognition. It's about accuracy. About what actually happened during the past 6 months." Emma set the plate down and turned to face me, her expression becoming guarded. "Mom, I thought we were past this. The wedding was beautiful, everyone had a wonderful time, and I'm married to the love of my life. Can't that be enough?" "What?"
I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "You're claiming that you coordinated the wedding planning while working full-time. You're accepting praise for organizational skills and project management abilities that you didn't actually demonstrate. You're taking credit for work I did." Emma's cheeks flushed slightly. "I did coordinate the planning. I made every major decision. I chose the venue, the flowers, the menu, the music. I managed the timeline and made sure everything came together." "No, Emma, you didn't. You made choices from options I researched and presented to you. You approved timelines I created and vendor relationships I managed. Making final decisions is important, but it's not the same as doing the work to implement those decisions." "I can't believe we're having this argument," Emma said, her voice rising slightly. "You're my mother. You're supposed to want me to succeed, to be proud when people compliment my abilities." "I am proud of you," I said firmly, "but I'm not proud of you taking credit for work you didn't do. And I'm concerned that you don't seem to see the difference." Emma stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "You know what? Fine. Let's lay it all out. You want to know exactly who did what? I'll tell you." She began counting on her fingers, her tone becoming sharp and defensive. "I found the venue. I spent 3 weekends touring different locations until I found the perfect one. After I researched 17 options and narrowed them down to 5 based on your budget and requirements," I interrupted, I chose the flowers, Emma continued, ignoring my comment. From arrangements, I coordinated with 3 different florists, including driving to their studios so you could see examples of their work. I selected the menu. After I set up tastings with 4 different caterers and researched dietary restrictions for all your guests, I managed the timeline. I created the timeline. You approved it. Emma's face was getting redder with each exchange. Fine, you helped with logistics. But I was working full-time while this was happening. I was managing my regular job while also making all these wedding decisions. That's not nothing. You're right, that's not nothing. But making decisions isn't the same as planning and coordinating. Sarah's speech made it sound like you were managing vendor relationships and creating timelines while working full-time. That's what you accepted praise for, and that's not what actually happened. So what do you want me to do? Emma snapped. Call everyone who was at the wedding and tell them my mother actually planned everything? Send out a correction to all the social media posts? Retroactively change the maid of honor speech? The sarcasm in her voice stung, but I pressed on. I want you to acknowledge what actually happened. To me, if to no one else. Acknowledge what? That I helped with wedding planning? I never said you didn't. You said you helped with logistics. You're treating months of professional-level event coordination as if it were minor assistance.
Emma threw her hands up in frustration because that's what it was. You offered to help, I accepted your help, and together we planned a beautiful wedding. I don't understand why you need more credit than that. The word help hung in the air between us, carrying all the weight of our different perspectives. In Emma's mind, I'd been a helpful assistant to her wedding planning project. In reality, I'd been the project manager, while she'd been the client making final approvals. Emma, I said quietly, do you remember our conversation about the cake tasting? She frowned, caught off guard by the specific question. What about it? You told me you couldn't take time off work for vendor meetings, so you asked if I could handle the research and narrow down the options. Do you remember that? Vaguely, but... And the florist meeting.
The venue tours? The catering consultations? You attended final selections, but I did the initial research and coordination for all of them because you said you were too busy with work. Emma's defensive posture began to waver slightly as I continued. I took vacation days to meet with vendors. I used my professional contacts to get better pricing and priority scheduling. I created spreadsheets comparing options, timelines coordinating deliveries, and backup plans for weather contingencies. That's not helping with logistics, Emma. That's project management. For the first time since the conversation started, Emma was quiet. I could see her thinking, maybe remembering details she'd forgotten or never fully processed. But I was involved in every decision, she said, though with less conviction than before. Yes, you were, and your input was valuable and necessary, but being involved in decisions isn't the same as managing the project. When Sarah gave that speech about your organizational abilities, when people praised your coordination skills, when you accepted compliments for managing complex logistics, that was praise for work I actually did. Emma sank into one of the kitchen chairs, looking suddenly deflated. So you think I'm a fraud? That I don't deserve any credit for my own wedding? The hurt in her voice made my chest ache, but I couldn't back down now. I think you deserve credit for making thoughtful decisions and having a clear vision for what you wanted, but I don't think you deserve credit for the execution and coordination that made that vision possible. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken truths settling between us. Outside, I could hear Marcus still talking on his phone, his voice a distant murmur in the evening air. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice smaller than before. I guess I didn't really think about all the work you were doing behind the scenes. That's the problem, Emma. It wasn't behind the scenes to me. It was my daily reality for 6 months. But somehow it became invisible to everyone else, including you. I didn't mean for that to happen, she said quietly. I know you didn't. But it did happen, and when people praised you for work I'd done, you accepted that praise without correcting them or sharing credit. Emma looked up at me, tears starting to form in her eyes. I was just so happy that everyone thought I'd done a good job. I've never planned anything that big before, and when people were impressed, I liked feeling capable and organized. I liked feeling like I could handle complicated projects. The honesty in her admission broke something open in my chest. I could see the young woman who'd always struggled with confidence, who'd been overwhelmed by choices throughout the planning process, and who genuinely felt proud when people praised her abilities. "Emma," I said gently, "you are capable and organized. You have many wonderful qualities, but accepting credit for work you didn't do isn't the way to demonstrate those qualities." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know. I think I just got caught up in how good it felt to have people think I was so competent. Especially Sarah. She's always been better at everything than me. When she gave that speech about my independence and organizational skills, I felt like maybe I could be the kind of person who handles big projects and makes things happen. But you can be that person, Emma. You just have to actually do the work instead of accepting credit for someone else's work." We talked for another hour, Emma gradually acknowledging specific examples of work I'd done that she'd mentally attributed to herself. It wasn't easy for her to hear, and it wasn't easy for me to say, but slowly we began to reconstruct a more accurate version of the past 6 months. When Marcus came back inside, he found us both red-eyed but calmer. Emma looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Marcus, I need to tell you something about the wedding planning." Over the next 30 minutes, Emma walked Marcus through the real division of labor during the planning process. To his credit, Marcus listened without defensiveness and asked thoughtful questions. When she finished, he turned to me with genuine respect. "Carol, I had no idea you'd done so much work. When Emma talked about managing everything, I assumed she meant she was actually managing the vendors and timelines herself." "I let people think that," Emma said quietly. "I didn't correct anyone when they praised my planning abilities, even though Mom did most of the actual planning." Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. "Thank you for everything you did to make our day perfect and for doing it so seamlessly that Emma could just focus on being a bride." The gratitude in his voice was healing in a way I hadn't expected. Someone finally understood the scope of what I'd contributed. "What do we do now?" Emma asked. "How do I fix this?" I thought about it for a moment.
"I don't need you to issue public corrections or take back social media posts, but I do need you to stop accepting credit for work you didn't do. And I need you to be more aware of when you're benefiting from support that you're not acknowledging." Emma nodded slowly. "This isn't just about the wedding, is it? You're talking about other things, too." I was quiet for a moment, then decided on honesty. "It's been a pattern, Emma. Throughout your adult life, you've had advantages and support that you've presented as personal achievements. I've enabled that by not speaking up, but I'm not comfortable doing it anymore." The conversation that followed was difficult, but necessary. Emma began to recognize other instances where she'd accepted credit for outcomes that had been supported by resources she hadn't provided herself. Her debt-free college graduation that she attributed to financial responsibility rather than parental tuition payments. Her professional network that she presented as evidence of her people skills, rather than acknowledging the connections I'd helped cultivate. It wasn't malicious on Emma's part, we realized. She'd genuinely forgotten or minimized the support she'd received, focusing instead on the aspects where she'd made decisions or taken action. But the pattern was clear once we started looking for it. By the time they left that evening, something fundamental had shifted between us. Emma hugged me tightly at the door and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me get away with this anymore. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't good for me either." The following weeks brought gradual changes. Emma started being more accurate about her accomplishments in conversations with friends and family. When someone complimented her wedding planning skills, she began sharing credit appropriately. "My mom actually handled most of the vendor coordination," she'd say. "I made the decisions, but she did the implementation." The shift wasn't always comfortable for people who'd preferred this simpler narrative, but Emma stuck with it. She even called Sarah to clarify the actual division of labor during wedding planning, explaining that her maid of honor speech, while well-intentioned, hadn't accurately reflected who'd done what. More importantly, Emma began approaching new projects with a more realistic understanding of what it meant to truly manage something independently. When she volunteered to coordinate a fundraising event for her nonprofit, she took on the actual vendor management and timeline development herself, calling me occasionally for advice, but handling the work personally. "It's so much more complicated than I realized," she told me after her first week of vendor calls. "I had no idea how many details you were managing during the wedding planning. I feel like I owe you an apology for every time I claimed I was organized." I laughed, but gently. "You are organized, Emma. You just hadn't had experience with this kind of complex project management. Now you're learning what it actually involves." The fundraising event went well, though not without some mistakes and learning curve that Emma navigated herself. When it was over, she called me with genuine pride in her voice. "Mom, I actually coordinated this whole event myself. And when people complimented the planning, I knew I'd really earned the praise this time." The satisfaction in her voice was different from what I'd heard after the wedding. This was the sound of someone who'd actually accomplished what she was being recognized for. Our relationship settled into a new equilibrium over the following months. Emma became more conscious of acknowledging support and resources she received, and I became more comfortable asserting the value of my contributions instead of deflecting praise toward her. It wasn't always smooth. Decades of established patterns don't change overnight, but we were both committed to maintaining the honesty we'd fought to achieve. Looking back, I realized that my frustration about the wedding credit had never really been about recognition from strangers. It had been about Emma's willingness to accept praise for work she hadn't done, and about the pattern that represented in our relationship. By finally speaking up, I'd forced us both to confront a dynamic that wasn't healthy for either of us. Emma learned that true accomplishment feels different from borrowed recognition, and I learned that protecting someone from the truth, even with the best intentions, isn't actually protection at all. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's comfortable fiction, even when the truth is harder to hear. The wedding had been beautiful, exactly as I'd planned it to be, but the real celebration came months later, when Emma earned her first genuine compliment for event coordination skills she'd actually demonstrated. That moment of authentic pride was worth every difficult conversation we'd had to reach it. 6 months after our kitchen confrontation, I received an unexpected phone call from Patricia, Marcus's mother. We'd maintained polite contact since the wedding, exchanging holiday cards and brief updates when our children visited, but she'd never called me directly before. "Carol, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she began, her voice carrying that formal tone she used for serious conversations. "I wanted to discuss something that's been on my mind since Emma and Marcus's wedding."
I wanted to discuss something that's been on my mind since Emma and Marcus's wedding. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach, wondering if Emma had shared details of our conversation with Marcus's family. "Of course, Patricia. What's on your mind?" "Well, it's rather delicate, but I've been thinking about the planning process and some inconsistencies I noticed at the time." She paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. I was quite impressed with Emma's apparent organizational abilities during the planning months, but some things didn't quite add up. My pulse quickened. Patricia was notorious for her attention to detail and her ability to spot discrepancies in people's stories. If anyone would have noticed the gaps in Emma's claims, it would be her. "What kind of inconsistencies?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this was heading. "When I would call Emma to discuss wedding details, she often seemed unfamiliar with vendor arrangements she supposedly had made herself. She would need to call me back after checking with you, or she would transfer me to you directly to handle logistics questions." Patricia's voice became more confident as she continued.
And during our venue visit, when the coordinator asked about timeline specifics, Emma looked completely lost until you stepped in with detailed answers. I found myself holding my breath, unsure how to respond without betraying Emma's confidence. Patricia continued, "At the time, I assumed Emma was just delegating details to you as a courtesy, allowing you to feel involved in the planning.
But after watching her at the reception accept all that praise for coordination work, I began to suspect something different was happening. Patricia, I appreciate your observation, but I'm not sure what you're hoping I'll say. I'm hoping you'll confirm what I suspect, that you did the majority of the actual wedding planning and Emma has been taking credit for your work. The directness of the question caught me off guard. Patricia had never been one to dance around issues, but this felt particularly bold, even for her. Why does it matter to you? I asked carefully. Because I don't like seeing people claim credit they haven't earned, especially when it comes at someone else's expense. And because I think it reflects poorly on Emma's character if she's willing to accept praise for accomplishments that aren't hers. Patricia's moral certainty was both refreshing and slightly intimidating. She'd clearly been thinking about this for months, building her case based on observations she'd made during the planning process. You're not wrong, I admitted finally. I did handle most of the vendor coordination and logistics. Emma made the final decisions, but the implementation work was primarily mine. I thought so, Patricia said with satisfaction, and I imagine it was quite hurtful to watch her accept praise for your efforts without correction or acknowledgement. It was, I said simply. Have you addressed this with Emma? I told Patricia about our conversation and Emma's gradual recognition of the problem. To my surprise, Patricia listened with what sounded like approval rather than judgment. Good for you, she said when I finished. It couldn't have been easy to confront her, especially after the wedding was over and she was basking in all that positive attention. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I realized I'd been enabling the pattern by not speaking up earlier. Patricia was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Carol, I owe you an apology. During the planning process, I made several comments to other family members about Emma's impressive organizational skills. I contributed to the narrative that credited her with work you were actually doing. You didn't know, I said, though I appreciated her acknowledgement. I should have paid closer attention. The signs were there if I'd been looking for them. She paused again. I'd like to correct the record, if you're comfortable with that. Not dramatically, but when the topic comes up in family conversations, I'd like to acknowledge your actual contribution. The offer touched me more than I expected. Patricia's opinion carried weight in their family, and her willingness to revise her understanding meant something significant. That would mean a lot to me, I said honestly. Our conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia sharing observations about other family dynamics she'd noticed over the years. She had a sharp eye for patterns of credit taking and responsibility avoiding, and she'd apparently been cataloging examples for some time. It's not uncommon, she told me. I see it frequently in my social circle. Adult children who present their parents' support as personal achievements, who accept praise for outcomes their families made possible. The parents usually enable it because they don't want to diminish their children's self-esteem. That's exactly what I was doing, I admitted. I thought protecting Emma's self-esteem was more important than accuracy. But accuracy is part of character development. Allowing someone to accept unearned credit doesn't actually help their self-esteem in the long run. It just teaches them to be comfortable with dishonesty. After we hung up, I felt a profound sense of validation. Patricia's call confirmed that the pattern I'd identified wasn't imaginary or petty. It had been visible to others who'd been paying attention. More importantly, it reinforced my decision to address the issue directly rather than continuing to enable it. That evening, Emma called with news about her nonprofit's upcoming gala, which she was coordinating as her first major independent project event. The difference in her approach was immediately apparent. "Mom, this is so much harder than I expected," she said, but her voice carried excitement rather than complaint. "I spent 3 hours today just trying to coordinate delivery schedules with 5 different vendors. How did you manage 15 vendors for the wedding without losing your mind?" I smiled at the acknowledgement embedded in her question. "Lots of spreadsheets and backup plans. How are you handling the timeline development?" "I created a master schedule, but I keep finding conflicts I didn't anticipate. The florist needs 2 hours for setup, but that overlaps with the catering prep time, and the sound technician can't arrive until after the floral setup is complete." She paused, laughing. "I have a whole new appreciation for what you did during my wedding planning." "You'll figure it out," I assured her. "The first major event is always a learning curve, but you're asking the right questions." I am learning so much about actual project management. It's completely different from just making decisions about what I want things to look like.
Emma's voice carried genuine enthusiasm. When this is over, if people compliment my coordination skills, I'll actually know what they're talking about. 3 weeks later, Emma's gala was a success.
Not perfect. There were small timing issues and one vendor miscommunication, but successful enough that her nonprofit colleagues were genuinely impressed with her coordination abilities. The best part, Emma told me afterward, was knowing that when people praised my organizational skills, I'd actually earned that praise. It felt completely different from the wedding compliments. How so? The wedding compliments felt good in the moment, but they were hollow because I knew I hadn't actually done the work people were praising. These compliments feel solid. They're based on something real that I accomplished myself. Emma's insight captured something important about the difference between borrowed recognition and earned achievement. The hollow feeling she'd described helped explain why she'd been so defensive initially. On some level, she'd known the praise wasn't fully justified. Our relationship continued to evolve as Emma took on more independent projects, and I became more comfortable asserting my own contributions. The shift affected other family dynamics too, as Emma became more conscious of acknowledging support and resources in all areas of her life. During a family dinner several months later, Emma was telling David and Jennifer about a work promotion she'd received. Instead of simply accepting their congratulations, she provided context about the mentorship and networking support that had helped make the promotion possible. Mom connected me with Sarah Martinez, who gave me advice about positioning myself for advancement, Emma explained, and she helped me practice for the interview, which made a huge difference in my confidence level. David looked surprised but pleased. I didn't realize Carol had been so involved in your career development. She's been involved in more things than I used to acknowledge, Emma said, meeting my eyes across the table. I'm trying to be better about giving credit where it's actually due. Jennifer nodded approvingly. That's mature of you, Emma. It's easy to forget how much support goes into our achievements. The conversation felt natural and honest in a way that previous family discussions often hadn't. Emma's willingness to share credit didn't diminish her accomplishments. If anything, it made her achievements feel more impressive because she was being honest about the full context. Later that evening, David pulled me aside as we were cleaning up after dinner. I notice a change in how Emma talks about her accomplishments, he said. She's much more aware of acknowledging help and support than she used to be. We had some difficult conversations about that pattern after the wedding. She was taking credit for coordination work I'd actually done, and it forced us to examine some broader issues about acknowledgement and accuracy. David nodded slowly. I probably contributed to that pattern without realizing it. I remember praising her independence and self-sufficiency over the years, without always knowing how much support she was actually receiving. We all contributed to it, I said. I enabled it by not speaking up, and she perpetuated it by accepting credit she hadn't earned. But I think we found a better balance now. It shows, David said. She seems more confident somehow, even though she's being more honest about getting help. That's counterintuitive, but it makes sense. David's observation was astute. Emma did seem more confident since we'd addressed the credit-taking pattern, which had surprised me initially. But I'd come to understand that genuine confidence comes from authentic achievement, not borrowed recognition. By learning to coordinate events independently and acknowledge support appropriately, Emma had developed real skills and honest self-awareness that served as a stronger foundation than inflated claims ever could. The wedding that had started this journey felt like a different lifetime now, though it had been less than a year. I still looked at the photos occasionally, remembering both the beauty of the day and the pain of watching Emma accept praise for my work. But the photos also reminded me of what we'd built from that difficult experience, an honest, respectful relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we'd pretended to be. Emma's marriage was thriving too, strengthened by the honesty that had emerged from our confrontation. Marcus had developed a clearer understanding of both Emma's genuine strengths and the support systems that had helped shape her opportunities.
Their relationship was more balanced because it was based on reality rather than carefully maintained fictions. The experience had taught me something crucial about the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. True support helps people develop their own capabilities and achieve genuine accomplishments. Enabling, by contrast, allows people to claim credit they haven't earned and avoid the growth that comes from honest self-assessment. I'd spent years thinking I was being a good mother by making Emma's achievements look effortless and allowing her to take credit for work I'd contributed. But I'd actually been depriving her of opportunities to develop real competence and authentic confidence. The most loving thing I could do was insist on truth, even when the truth was more complicated than the fiction we'd all found comfortable. Now, when Emma accomplished something independently, her pride was genuine and lasting. When she acknowledged support she'd received, her gratitude was real rather than peremptory. And when people praised her abilities, she knew exactly what she'd done to earn that recognition. The wedding had been beautiful, exactly as I'd planned it to be. But the relationship Emma and I built in its aftermath was something even more valuable. Honest, respectful, and based on who we actually were rather than who we'd pretended to be.